Have you ever felt like you were wandering around in the darkness, unsure of where to go or what to do? Like I asked the kids. Maybe you're feeling that way right now. I know for me, recently, there was a lot of uncertainty going on, right? There still kind of is. I think many of us in this church right now are feeling some of that uncertainty, knowing that I got approved for commissioning and knowing that that means a change. But none of us know what that will be. I don't know it. Y'all don't know it. And every week since that has happened, and even before that, people are like, are they going to move you? What's going to happen to us? Right? We don't know. It's a dark time. We don't know what the future holds or what we're doing, maybe. In this chapter, which, by the way, we only read a couple of verses, but go read the entire chapter, John chapter 9. Read this story of Jesus healing this man. It is a really good story, and there's a lot that you can take away from it. But we see that Jesus heals this blind man, this physically blind man. He was given sight by Jesus, the light of the world. Today, we're going to explore this passage a little bit and discover how Jesus can bring light into the darkness of our lives, particularly where we are spiritually blind. And I think that is the overarching point that we can take away from this story today is we can talk about this being a sign from Jesus. We can talk about the very real miracle that happened in the story. But I think for us today, the thing that we need to focus on is the places in which we are spiritually blind. And I'm going to talk about some of those specifically a little bit later in the sermon. But that is where most of us have problems that can be directly addressed by this chapter. I hope by the end of this, you see Jesus a little more clearly, you see yourself a little more clearly, and you discover how Jesus can heal those areas of darkness, spiritual blindness. We see that Jesus heals this man who was born blind, but this miraculous healing leads to controversy. Now, you wouldn't think that, but so many of Jesus's miracles lead to controversy. They have people complaining about what he has done. We can learn about our own spiritual blindness and the importance of placing our faith in Jesus from this chapter. But the major truth in John chapter 9 is that Jesus is the light of the world, that Jesus does bring clarity, that Jesus gives us sight in the places where we cannot see. And those that believe in him will have their spiritual blindness healed, should they choose to have it healed. As believers, we need to recognize our own spiritual blindness and place our faith in Jesus that it can be healed. And so if you are in this room and you are not a believer, that's fine. Jesus can do this for you too. But as believers, it's a necessity. So when I say that, recognize that it's not optional to have Jesus heal our spiritual blindness and continue to claim to be followers of Christ. We need to recognize our own spiritual blindness. We have to recognize the places where that happens. And I know that some of you in here right now are saying, but I have placed my faith in Jesus. I have placed my faith in Jesus. And I would ask this, are you sure about that? Are you sure about that? Have you placed your faith in the Jesus of the Gospels? Not the Jesus of the right, or the Jesus of the left, or the Jesus of politics, modern day American politics, I mean, because Jesus was absolutely a political figure of his day. But have you placed your faith in the Jesus of the Gospels? Or have you placed your faith in some version of Jesus that is not centered on the Gospels? And that's a whole other sermon or series of sermons. But if you are sitting here going, this sermon isn't for me because I've placed my faith in Jesus and Jesus has healed my blindness. We're going to see about that. But I still always come back to, have you placed your faith in the Jesus of the Gospels? Because that is the Jesus that heals. That is the Jesus that saves. That is the Jesus that we follow as Christians. Now, only when we have followed that Jesus will we truly understand the will of God. Only when we have will we understand the will of God. Now, the Pharisees had a problem in this story, and you'll see that if you go read it. In this passage, they were blinded by their own pride and legalism. These are two places in which the Pharisees are constantly spiritually blind. They were blinded by their own pride and their own legalism. Now, I'm sure that's not a problem for anybody here. If you're worshiping with us online, I'm sure you've never, not ever, had this problem. But the Pharisees, they refused to see the truth that was right in front of them and were more concerned about following their own rules and traditions than actually following God. They were more concerned with the boxes they could fit God in than following the God that fits no boxes. Let me say that one again. They were more concerned about the boxes they could fit God in than following the God that fits no boxes. But the good news, even for them, and especially for us, is that Jesus offers grace to those willing to see. Grace is available to all. You just got to be willing to receive it. You got to be willing to see. Just as Jesus healed the blind man in this passage, he can heal our spiritual blindness and lead us into the light. Lead us into the light. So the question becomes, how do we overcome our own spiritual blindness and truly see Jesus? How do we overcome our spiritual blindness and truly see Jesus? What are the obstacles that might be keeping us from placing our faith in him rather than placing our faith in the boxes that we put him in? What are the obstacles? Well, as the old saying goes, the first step to fixing a problem is admitting that you have one. So I recommend that we all do that right now, internally. Admit we are all spiritually blind to one degree or another. We all have this problem. You, me, everybody. And to that effect, we must humble ourselves and admit this fact. We must admit this fact that we are spiritually blind in places. We need to ask Jesus to reveal himself to us and help us see him more clearly. We need to focus on Christ, not on the boxes. The first step for us might be opening the box and realizing there's something in it. So many of us worship the box. We're so dense that we worship the box. So we must be willing to let go of our own rules, our own traditions, maybe even some of our own beliefs, and submit to Christ's will for our lives. That's going to mean some hard things for many of us. Some hard things for some of us. It's going to mean giving up our tendencies toward legalism, like the Pharisees. This idea, the strict adherence to man-made rules. As well-intentioned as they might be, and usually they are, the Pharisees thought they were doing the right thing by trying to keep people in accord with what they thought God wanted, right? But holding on to these with an iron grip usually leads to rigid and judgmental views of others and can limit our understanding of God's grace and love. It means giving up our tendency toward individualism, which is going to be a real hard one in our culture. But this hyper-focus on personal success and achievement that often causes us to overlook the needs of others and neglect our responsibility to seek justice and mercy for those who are oppressed and marginalized. Again, this is not optional as a follower of the Christ of the Gospels. This is step one. It's the main thing we do. Giving up our individual self for the collective good of the kingdom. It means giving up our tendency towards personal cultural bias. This tendency to view the world only through our own cultural lens and assuming a posture that our experience is the only one from which to base all other experiences. We all do this to one degree or another. To put it more simply, it's the idea that things only matter if they happen to me or people like me. And if you don't think that's a reality in our world, just look at the politics over the last decade. It doesn't matter what side you're on. We're all doing this. That our experience is the only experience that matters. It means giving up our tendency toward fear and mistrust, our tendency to be skeptical of those who are different than us. Again, look at our politics. Look at our church lives. Dr. Martin Luther King said it, the most segregated hour is 10 o'clock on Sunday. Still is all these years later. But this skepticism of those who are different than us, which can cause us to withdraw into our circles and miss opportunities to show the love of Jesus to those who need it most. When we only hang around with Christians, we are not going to be able to love the world because we're not engaged with it. And we won't engage with the world if we constantly approach it with a posture of fear and mistrust. It means giving up our tendency toward intellectualism. And boy, oh boy, is this a problem for all of us. This focus on knowledge and understanding that can lead to a lack of action and engagement. I call this the Bible study syndrome. It's the idea that as long as I'm learning about God, that's enough. No, it is not. And if you've ever been in my Bible study, you already know this because I'm heavy on the practicality of what we know. What you know matters none if you don't do anything with it. But so many of us think as long as I believe right, or as long as I'm learning, that's enough. It's not. Any teacher in this room can tell you that the stuff that they've taught doesn't mean anything unless it's applied. It doesn't mean anything unless it's applied. And finally, it means giving up the tendency to think that the way we do it is the only way to do it. That the way we do it is the only way to do it. And I'm specifically talking about how we experience God. How we experience God. You could blanket this statement across anything, but I'm going to focus on how we experience God. That the way we do it is the only way. Because the Pharisees experienced God in a very specific way, but Jesus gave the experience of God to the blind man in a very different way. And they were against that because it wasn't the way they did it. It wasn't the way they knew it. One of the biggest roadblocks to reaching new people, to loving new people, to making new disciples, and growing as a church or an individual is the idea that if I don't experience God in a particular way, then nobody can. And so any attempt to experience God in a way different than ours is viewed as wrong or inadequate. Having our spiritual blindness healed means getting rid of all of these things, or at least addressing them, because I don't think any of us are going to be able to completely eliminate all of them all at once, especially. It's a process. It's a journey. Every one of these things I just described, legalism, individualism, personal cultural bias, hanging on to fear and mistrust, intellectualism, thinking that our way is the only way for everyone, all of these are places of spiritual blindness that we all suffer from one degree or another. So as we think about these places of spiritual blindness and how they affect us and how we are informed by them, let us remember that Jesus is the light that can clarify it all. Jesus is the light of the world. Jesus is the one that brings sight to the blind, and Jesus is the one that can bring clarity and vision and newness and goodness and healing to the places of our spiritual blindness. He has the power. He has the technology, as the saying goes. We just have to be willing. That's the kicker here. Jesus can help us in these areas. Jesus has helped me in these areas, and he continues to help me in these areas. But you have to be willing. If you sit there rigid and say, no, I'm not going to do it, I do it myself. First of all, you sound like a toddler. And second of all, it means you're not willing. You're not willing to let Jesus bring sight to your life. So let us celebrate the fact that we serve a God who is able and willing to heal us and bring us into the light. May we continue to follow him and see more clearly each day. Amen? Amen. Man, I'm so glad to be back in the lectionary. Love that story. So with that, our call to action this week is the same it's been for a couple.